Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Dr. Eric Silverman. Hey there, Dr. Silverman.
Hey, Jordan.
He is a professor of philosophy at Christopher Newport University, and he's written this really interesting recent paper on the role that a meaningful life can play in answering the problem of evil. So we're going to discuss that paper, try our best to summarize it for you. And thank you so much for coming on. I got to meet you in person about 2 months ago now.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
We had a good connection, and I thought I need to get this guy on my channel. So that's how the magic happens. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the paper here. What do you aim to show in the paper? What are you trying to argue?
Great. Well, just to give a little backdrop, we're talking about the problem of evil. One of the major arguments against the existence of a all-powerful good God. And there's some standard responses to this question: why would God allow evil? Things like free will, or maybe it helps with virtue in a special way, or maybe it's necessary for an authentic relationship with God to be truly chosen and not forced. So I've been doing research on the value of meaningfulness in general. It goes back to an interdisciplinary grant I've been doing with some folks based at Biola University. And we were examining meaningfulness in suffering, especially with cancer survivors. And as I was examining meaningfulness, it turned out that we saw that there's models of human well-being, that having a meaningful life is an important aspect of human well-being. And it turns out there's really not a lot written about this, relating it to the bigger problem of evil. So I had an epiphany, a thought, and I said, well, let's see what kind of a role this can have in explaining evil. So I don't want to be really bold and say that evil allows for a meaningful life, and that the value of that is so overwhelming in itself, that just explains everything. But it definitely seems that there are kinds of meaningful lives that you can't have without evil. And some of these are really valuable. Things like the value of unrequited love, the things like the value of experiencing resisting temptation, and things like that. And the value of the meaningfulness, the value of the meaningfulness that this can add to life is worth something towards explaining why evil might exist. And as I've long pointed out with the problem of evil, it doesn't have to exist for just one reason. It doesn't just have to be one thing that explains it. It can be a bunch of things combined. So if this explains, say, 10% of evil and makes it balances it out, or explains some portion of it better, then I'm happy to add it into the mix for people to consider when talking about the problem of evil.
Yes. Yeah, so the way I was thinking of it, to piggyback on what you're saying, is what a theodicy is trying to do is provide some good reason that God has, a very plausible good reason that God has for allowing or permitting evil. And like you said, it doesn't just have to be that there's just one reason.
Right.
And so it's not the goal of your paper to try and say a meaningful life, that's the reason that God allows evil, as if that's the only one. And you're not even saying out of the variety of reasons he has, this is the main one. I don't even take you to be saying that. You're just saying this is one of the reasons. And so it can provide some role in a theodicy. It doesn't have to be the main or only one. So
Exactly.
am I getting that idea correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The only thing that's really particularly special about this is that it's barely been talked about in the past. So that's what's sort of special here, is we're adding something to the conversation that generally doesn't get mentioned.
Yes. Okay, so now we're going to look at the actual details that you go through in the paper, the argument itself. First, I found this really helpful, actually. At the beginning of the paper, you explain why the plausibility of the problem of evil increases or decreases based on what your theory of well-being is. And I hadn't heard that, I guess, put that way before. So I thought it'd be helpful for you to start with that.
Great, great. Yeah. So there are theories of well-being and theories of what is good in general. And what our theory of the good, our theory of value sort of establishes in one way or another is what we really think is important. And once you identify this or that or this group of things is important, then those are the things that you assume a good, perfect God would have to be preoccupied with. So one of the things that I've noticed about the problem of evil is that people who are really concerned about it usually think that pleasure, especially earthly physical pleasure, is really, really important. Either it's like the only value, or it's at the very least the most important, or a very, very important one. And you can even compare this theory with other thoroughly secular theories of the good, things like what the Stoics might have valued, something like to be perfected in human virtue is what one of the central goods for humanity. And if you think developing virtue is what's really important for humanity, then guess what? Then you don't worry about the problem of evil so much. Why? Well, because evil, if anything, evil might even be necessary for developing virtue. At the very least, a lot of the harms we see are harms directly against causing pain, or against the possibilities of pleasure, or against health and length of life. So often, depending on what your value theory is, and including your theory of human well-being, that often sort of sets the standard for what you expect a good God to be interested in. So again, if you think God is mainly interested in character development, well, then you look out at this world and you say, well, gee, this world doesn't seem all that bad if the goal of life is character development, because there's lots of challenges, lots of things to develop character against. But if the goal of life is to have a perfect, idyllic, carefree life, well, then this isn't the sort of world that kind of God would create. That being said, I don't know any major religion where that's the kind of God that's out there and that's what he's primarily interested in. So there's an important relationship between what we think is good, our theory of value, and including our theory of human well-being, and what direction the problem of evil takes.
Yeah. So with that said, you spend a section of the paper talking about why you think that one's theory of well-being needs to include this particular good, and that's the good of a meaningful life. So why do you say that? Why does our theory of well-being need to include this good of a meaningful life?
So one of the interesting things is that this is something that in psychology has really there's been a lot of research and interest in this just very recently, and it's been neglected for some time. But in psychology, there's been a lot recently, and Susan Wolf in philosophy and David McPherson in philosophy have both recently written about the importance of meaningfulness. And meaningfulness often has to do with sort of proper engagement with life, having our life be about something, engaged with valuable things and valuable activities. And if you look, there's an interesting range of philosophers that really put their finger on the value of a meaningful life and say, yeah, this is really important. So let me give you some quotations. Viktor Frankl, the psychologist and Holocaust survivor, says that life is not primarily a quest for pleasure, as Freud believed, or a quest for power, as Alfred Adler taught, but a quest for meaning. Finding meaningful in life. One of my favorite people that I like to cite for this is a very sort of hostile witness here. Bernard Williams, one of the influential agnostics, has a famous argument that he wouldn't like the idea of heaven because he says immortality would become meaningless. And if we could even conceive of immortality, it would eventually become intolerable. Well, this idea from Williams is a great testimony to the value that we associate with having a meaningful existence. Williams literally says, if given the choice between eternity but meaningfulness and finite life with challenges but meaning, he'd rather have the finite life with meaning than an infinite life without meaning. Well, that's exactly the kind of intuition philosophically you need to make a meaningful life valuable enough to justify a significant amount of evil. So you can also look at Camus, who basically says one of the central tasks of life is to find to give meaning to life. That's even harder. You don't have to find the meaning; you have to give the meaning to your existence. And if you fail to, then he even says maybe suicide's even a legitimate option if you fail to do that. Again, loss of existence itself is more highly regarded than having a meaningless, absurd existence. So there's an interesting range of philosophers that put a high value on having a meaningful life, and an awful lot of them aren't particularly religious or Christian.
Yes. You mentioned in the paper that one reason we need to make a meaningful life be included in our theory of well-being is it actually makes sense of a lot of choices that people make. And if without a meaningful life, their choices just look completely irrational. So our theory needs to include it. Can you explain that?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to simply quote Susan Wolf on this because I'm borrowing her argument and I want to give her proper credit for that. So here's her quotation. She says, "A man opts for the more challenging of two possible careers, even at the cost of stress and insecurity. A woman chooses to work for less pay at a job she believes is morally valuable. People arrange their lives so as to give a few hours a week to Meals on Wheels or to practicing piano or to keeping up with their book group, even though it means going with a little less sleep, less flexibility, less straightforward fun. Why? Because they will say they find these things fulfilling. They find them meaningful." And I would add to that, my favorite example of this is, frankly, having children. I mean, there's been a small literature in recent psychology that's proven what every parent already knows, that kids don't make your life more pleasurable and more fun in an immediate sense. But and some of these psychologists with a very thin view of happiness come to the incorrect conclusion. Therefore, we're stupid for having children, or that we shouldn't have children. Well, I think including meaningfulness in our account of happiness makes great sense of this. Why do we have kids? Because they are so completely worth it. They change the meaning of our lives, and they do complicate our lives immensely. They do require a lot of sleepless nights. And yet, in an age where we don't have to do this, we still choose to do this. And it's not because it's pleasurable or fun, although sometimes it's pleasurable or fun, but it's because it adds meaning to life. I remember a few days before my oldest daughter was born thinking, wow, I might never get to see a movie again. This, of course, is ridiculous. But, when you're about to be a new parent, it seems like forever. Maybe I'll never get to go to a restaurant again. Again, ridiculous. But then, the day after my daughter was born and I was holding her, I'm like, oh, I get it now. I don't care whether or not I ever do those things again, because I've now been trusted with this wonderful little life. And guess what? That's infinitely more meaningful than those other things I was wasting my time with. And I've still found a way to waste my time with plenty of those things since then. But still, what's meaningful to me isn't those things. It's invested into my family.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift now to this this next step in your argument. you begin talking about this tension that the problem of evil centers on, and your proposals that that tension we can help resolve it at least a little bit uh, by appealing to a meaningful life. So why don't you explain that for us? And I think you have a slide I can pull up if you'd like.
Sure, sure. Um, I'm not sure which. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, the
So
tension.
I mean, so again, it's just among the reasons, among the goods that evil might allow is either a more meaningful life, or certain kinds of meaningful lives, or some especially valuable kinds of meaningful lives. Why don't you put the slide on that has the list of especially meaningful lives, or kinds of meaningful lives that might require evil. Now, some people have suggested, and again, this goes back to people like Bernard Williams, says things like, yeah, it's not this slide. Keep going. One more. No.
Hmm.
There it is. There it is.
Okay.
So some people might say that to have any meaning at all, you need challenges, you need setbacks, you need, things to do, things to go wrong, things that are left to be accomplished. So it might be that you need some possibility of disappointment or frustration, or at least some sense of evil, some sense of limitedness, to have any meaning at all. So that's one possibility. But it's certain. While I'm not going to put a lot of stock in that, but I am going to put a lot of stock in there's certain kinds of valuable meanings that you need evil to exist for, or at least the potential for evil, or at least temptation. So if you're a religious person, this first bullet point is an obvious one. For pursuit of God while striving against temptation and evil, for that kind of meaningful life to exist, you need the possibility of temptation and evil. Courage in the face of risk and danger. Valor is one of the great epic values. I mean, we still read about the valor of Hector in the Iliad in facing the fierce Achilles, even though he probably knew he had very little chance of risking the supernaturally blessed Achilles. The idea that temptations overcome. There's value in moral progress. There's a relational benefit, the meaning, not just the relationship itself, but the meaningfulness of relationships developed in an imperfect situation where we have to share finite resources, where pain is a real thing and we have to empathize with other people in their pain, where people actually experience loss. Compassion. Can't have compassion without suffering. And maybe compassion is worth something. Again, it's not just the virtue itself, but the meaning added to life, to meaning provided by having compassion in your life. So the compassion is one value, but the meaning of experiencing the value of a compassionate life is a second additional value. Redemption. I once was lost, but now is found. Now I'm found. That's a major religious theme, and a lot of religious people think that's really at the core of value. As one passage in the New Testament says, all the angels rejoice more over a single repentant person than over 99 people that never needed to repent. So there's a value and meaning to found in themes like redemption, and to have a redeemed life. That's special in a way that having an idyllic life that was never redeemed, never experienced suffering and sorrow, never experienced temptation and giving into it, it has a special qualitative value.
Okay, yeah. So this was a huge chunk of the paper that you spent, and you spent on going through this list and giving example, like very, like actual narratives, not just a blanket statement like, um, a kind of summary, but you actually, talked about real people doing real acts that were compassionate or were sacrificial, and so on. And I thought, man, that was so helpful, to see. Yeah, that, because you feel it when you read that narrative of that person. You just feel like, oh yeah, they that was very meaningful what they went through, and what they did. So, now going back to, the question that we started with, I'll zoom back to an earlier slide here. So we said, the problem of evil has this. It focuses on this tension, and it's, about basically why this good God, if he does exist, if such a being does exist, would allow all these evil things. And it seems like the point you're making is, well, many of these evils actually make it possible that there be more meaning, that what our lives, what we experience in our lives, is even more meaningful, than it could be, with if he did not if he did not include those evils. Am I getting at the idea?
Absolutely. Let me offer this example. If you think of great literature, nothing in great literature sounds like this. They all lounged around on the beach with their feet up, sipping their pina coladas, and nothing challenging ever happened to them. All of the great literature goes the opposite direction. All of the great literature is stories about people facing, serious, great, and sometimes horrifying evils. And some of these things we love. We love things like unrequited love or tragic love. We love Romeo and Juliet. We love that story. It's still being done hundreds of years later, and we had to have 2 remakes of it in versions of West Side Story because we couldn't get enough of that story. We love stories like that. We love stories like the stories of the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held and sacrificed their lives against a huge invading force. They were fighting a hopeless battle against impossible odds, and they were proud to do it. So you can think of all the great literature that we think is worth preserving, and it's very hard to find great literature that doesn't have substantial evils and challenges and suffering involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned a few examples, and I actually just recently read this book by, Christian Miller. I think it's called The Character Gap. He's going to be coming on in a couple weeks, and he has this chapter on a particular individual, who, it was during during World War II, and what this guy did, his job was to work in the sewers. But what he actually did was he would hide Jews from Nazi soldiers, in these sewers, lots of Jews in these sewers. And every day he would have to crawl through these nasty sewers just to bring them bread. And if I remember correctly, what Christian Miller said was many times he would give the children his own lunch, because there just wasn't hardly, he couldn't carry all that food by himself, so he ended up giving them his own lunch. And at the end of that little story, it says that, Christian Miller's point is, like, his life, surely when we look at that, we think he is the type of person, I want to be like, precisely because that's such a valuable thing that he did. His life was so meaningful. I want my life to be meaningful like that. So I find a story like that, like, yeah, that his life was so meaningful, and none of that would have been meaningful, if there weren't any evils in the story. Like, there are evil parts of the story. Now, again,
And again, we don't want to be callous. I mean, we don't want to say the Holocaust happened because this guy gets to share his meal.
right.
But we do want to say this can play a role, and this is the sort of thing that Viktor Frankl talked a lot about. Is people who could find meaning within the suffering did did better than people who were unable to find meaning in the midst of that sort of suffering.
Mhm.
But just saying that, this plays a role in explaining
Yes.
why evils happen.
Yeah, it's not saying, and that justifies the Holocaust or anything like that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
okay, so you talked about some examples there. I guess bef we can go ahead and shift to objections. Did you wanna say anything else before we shift to objections to the kind of argument you're making?
Um, no, I think I've made my main point. How much time do we have for this main part of the?
We can go, let's go ahead and shift to objections,
Okay.
and, if you wanna throw something in during the Q&A, we can.
All right. Why
So
don't you advance to the objection section? So there were two main objections
right.
that I wanted to address, or I should say that the referees forced me to address as I was writing this paper. Um,
Let's see. Oh, there it is. Yes.
all right. So one objection, and it's something that's important to talk about. Maybe there's nothing really valuable in the meaningfulness of these scenarios apart from either virtue, character development, or the relationships, the value of the relationships involved. So this is significant because two of the things that are often mentioned in Theodicy prior to my paper is that virtue is perhaps one of the central reasons, a superior kind of character development, a more valuable kind of character development, or maybe challenges let relationships grow closer. And I grant both those things, but I go to some length to distinguish that there's two goods involved. One good is the objective value of things like virtue and relationships. But there's actually a second good here. There's a second good in sort of experientially getting subjectively enjoying activities connected to those objective values. And it's possible to be involved with things that are objectively good, but fail to experience them as meaningful. For example, that's a sign of depression. Clinical depression is where you can't experience the value of the things that you're surrounded with. That's one of the major symptoms. So I distinguish between those two goods: the good of the virtue and relationships themselves, and the good of finding meaning in the sorts of activities involved with them. One great thing about separating these two is it helps explain why it is good it helps us identify value even in the failed pursuit of these objective goods. So let's talk about unrequited love, Cyrano de Bergerac. If you know this story, it doesn't end well for Cyrano. Sorry, spoiler alert. But we again, we love these stories about unrequited love, and we find them to be valuable and worth preserving. Why? Because we identify meaningfulness in their pursuit, even when it doesn't pan out. This is also why we like tragic stories, why we like reading things like Romeo and Juliet, even though that doesn't end well either. We find value in the pursuit of something that's good, even when it's failed.
I
This
guess
is
that's the idea behind that saying of better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all.
good, Tennyson. Yes, I quote that in the paper as well. So yes, thank you. So yes, so yes, a lot of the things that we find meaning in are already mentioned in other theodicies, but the meaningfulness that such things provide is a distinct and additional, separate good that is worthy of examination. So I don't think that's. I mean, it's something that's important to talk about, but I don't think that's really a powerful objection.
Yeah, when I first was reading the paper, and yeah, maybe you can speak to this now as well. A thought that occurred to me was, so how exactly is this distinct from the soul building theodicy?
Right.
It seems like he's appealing to these narratives where characters grow in they soul build essentially. These people are building their souls in certain ways. So yeah, maybe you wanted, because that was a concern as I was reading it. You want to speak to that?
Well, sure. Again, there's two distinct things. There's the objective good of things like virtue and the relationships and soul building. But one of the additional benefits isn't just the virtue itself, but it's the meaningfulness of the relationship, of pursuing the relationship, of pursuing virtue, and so forth. So,
Even if the pursuit fails,
even if
you don't soul build, the fact that you were on this journey has meaning in it, provides meaning in itself.
Or let's use a real life example. Mother Teresa has been asked, or was asked, how do you keep going with the enormity of your task here, helping the poor dying in the streets of Calcutta? And she says, well, she finds meaning and value in just approaching one person at a time. And the fact that she will not succeed in her task of alleviating suffering or removing all suffering, the fact that that the number of people in need of help seems endless, and that she can only provide, a very limited kind of help to each person, she still finds meaning in that, even if it's just kind of a drop in the bucket.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the good of what's accomplished, but there's an additional good to the person doing it in experiencing it as something worthwhile, engaging. Okay. I mean, let me put it to you another way. It's easy for intelligent people to get bored. And it's much better to have meaningful, if sometimes challenging and frustrating and painful things, than to be bored. I think that's at the heart of the tedium objection and a lot of other things that we've mm-hmm. mentioned tonight.
All right. So there was a second objection that you talk about. What's this one?
Yeah. So here's the one that I think was a little more challenging. What if, God could have just created good, meaningful human lives with no evil or no suffering? So if we take something like the book of Genesis even moderately literally, it looks like it was possible to have something like a meaningful life, but before evil existed. And I think there's 2 or 3 kinds of responses. One thing that I didn't even mention up there is, even in that narrative, suffering and evil doesn't exist, but the temptation and possibility for it to exist did in that story. But even pushing that to the side, at the very, very least, there is value in an increased range and quantity and types of meaningful human lives that we've discussed. So there's definitely an increased in range and quantity of types of meaningful lives that are possible in a world with suffering and evil. So the quantitative point is obvious, but the qualitative point is the last bullet point on the slide. And there are some kinds of meaningful lives that are just sort of extra special, and you couldn't get them without evil, without at least some suffering, without at least some possibility for rejection. So part of the value of love in general is the possibility that it won't happen. So one of the great things about reading those Jane Austen stories is, after these women pursue love, is, they get it at the end, at least usually, that they achieve it at the end, but the possibility that it might not have happened, it has to be a real possibility, and that increases the value and the meaningfulness of the love, that the thought that it might not have happened. There's a reason why some of these stories about unrequited love, or again, courage, there's a reason why the Iliad is literally the sort of story that a society gets founded on. So some of these stories are so culturally important that we celebrate them and find so much meaning and value to them. And a lot of that value and meaning goes to aspects that require some amount of suffering and evil. Now, I of course have saved the best point for last. If we want to take the religious route, well, again, a lot of theologians say the best story wasn't that God creates a perfect world and we all live happily ever after. The best story is the redemption story, that God would so love the world so much that even after it falls away from him, he would go the extra sacrificial mile and take on flesh, be involved in the incarnation, and sacrifice himself. So again, there's a wide variety of people and value systems that identify that some sorts of meaningful stories are sort of extra special. And a lot of those most special, most meaningful kinds of stories are the kinds of stories that require an amount of evil and suffering.
Very good. Okay, so that ends the overview of your paper. And I'll let you wrap things up when we're ending the stream. But I want to go ahead and go to Q&A from the viewers now because they're raising their own objections.
I'm sure they are. Now I'm scared.
So let me go to the comments here. This one came from Tim. He asked, will heaven be less meaningful than the present age? If not, can't we run the problem of heaven that if God exists, he would have placed us in the most meaningful world? For example, heaven.
Sure. Yeah. So, fun fact: I also have a Oxford University Press book that's a collection of essays of philosophical issues and the idea of heaven. So I've thought about this, and I worried about this a little bit too. But one reason that I don't think this is sort of a serious problem is something like this. Part of the meaning of heaven is that we will already have experienced suffering and evil, and eternity might be made all the more meaningful because we've already had the experience of suffering and evil. So maybe you don't need the current possibility, but maybe the past experience is sufficient for the benefit of that meaning. And one thing that's always worth noting about the problem of evil is that happy ending, or at least the possibility of that happy ending, is an important infinite good that's out there that can do an awful lot of work outweighing certain kinds of evils in this life. But I don't think heaven will be less meaningful, no. But because it's built on the already existent meaning of this context. That's the happy ending to the story. That's like saying happily ever after kind of sucks. Well, happily ever after doesn't suck, but again, it's only more meaningful if you work to get there.
Okay. Question here. I think I only got 2 more questions. I haven't seen Andrew Moon in the live chat, which I'm a little surprised, but we'll see. He may show up. So Jamie Russell asked this: is God determining this evil or allowing or / just permitting it?
Yeah, great question. And simple truth, I have no idea. I'm happy to let other people deal with that issue. My opinion is that it's just a permission. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, there are smart theologians that go the stronger route, that God even short-term intended evil to create a greater good. Philosophers tend not to like that route. Philosophers tend to say God permits it, allows it to bring about a greater good. But there are more determinist theologians that really like, nope, God's so omnipotent in the micromanaging of things that, yep, he caused evil. I don't like saying that. I'm not comfortable with that. But so I lean towards the allow permitting it, but that's not my issue. Is the long story short. That's not my focus, one way or the other. My argument works either way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've got one more question that somebody typed in before we went live, and this may actually lead into your conclusion. So if you want to conclude with and wrap up the discussion with your answer, that's fine. So this individual saw the video, the title of the video. In the title, I think I call it the Theodicy of a Meaningful Life or something like that. And this individual said, just another ivory tower discussion.
Uh,
So, and I asked this individual, well, what do you explain that comment to me? Like, what were you intending to communicate? And he basically wanted to say, like, look, there are real people suffering on the ground, and this kind of like conversation just it doesn't value those people or the suffering that they're enduring, you by trying to like explain it away or something like that. So do you think that's what conversations like this do? Are these conversations in themselves harmful to people?
I mean,
What do you
I
think?
think there's a risk of trivializing things. I mean, I did feel the need to interrupt you when we were talking about the Holocaust because, I am sensitive to some of that. But here's what makes me think it's not just an ivory tower concern. Because this isn't my first paper on the problem of evil. As I mentioned, I've done a series of articles with this research group based at Biola, and we actually did interviews with cancer patients with a variety of outcomes, with a variety of experiences. Some were cured of cancer for years. Some had a terminal diagnosis. So we had a wide range. And we interviewed them, about what they thought this said about God. And these were all religious cancer patients. And we were surprised at how few people really were worried about, this means God doesn't exist. We were surprised at how much meaning people found in the midst of their cancer experience. And we're interested in how much people found significance in improved relationships with their family in times of suffering, how much they felt like they were changed as people, either morally or spiritually, because of these experiences. So, I mean, I never want to trivialize another person's suffering, but so here's where I reveal one of the reasons I was interested in the religious meaning of suffering and cancer to people is I myself am a multiple time cancer survivor. Going back to my 20s, I was diagnosed with cancer first when I was 26 on my fiance's 24th birthday in the middle of our
Man.
engagement. So, in a certain sense, this sucked. This was a really, the sort of slap in the face from, the world of suffering and the threat to my life and future good was very palpable. So one of the reasons why, I was interested in that is because I was interested, did other people have an experience as I did where, yeah, this was unpleasant, but you know what? I eloped with my fiance in the middle of this challenge. I got to see my wife commit herself to me, despite the fact that there was a real possibility I could die in 6 months or a year. So if I'm ever worried, is her love real or true or deep? I know what her love is like. And upon reflection, I think our love, in a certain sense, something about it would have been underexplored, under-revealed, had we not married under these specific circumstances. So I don't want to belittle anybody else's suffering, but I want to say, I found meaningfulness in some of the challenges I faced, and this isn't just an ivory tower thing. I don't want to. I haven't had the most idyllic life, but again, this is one of the reasons why I want to be humble about the range of my concerns. I found meaningfulness in the midst of some of my challenges, some of the evils I faced, but I don't want to say this makes the problem of evil go away completely, or immediately go applying it to slavery or the Holocaust, or some of these real, big capital E evils. But I do want to say it's one of the values that's in the field of value that has to be calculated, and it's worth something.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with me, and I hope that we get to meet in person again soon.
I look forward to that, Jordan.
All right. Thank you all for watching, and go and check out my whole playlist of videos on the problem of evil. It's growing all the time. I'll have about 5 new videos coming out in that playlist really, really soon, based on this book by Dr. Daniel Speak on the problem of evil. All right. We'll see you later. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan.